MTGC Requiem here. We are talking about Grixis Reanimator today. This is a deck tech. Dan Ward made this deck popular with the adjustment or the addition of um, Kari Zev's Expertise. This is a new card from Aether Revolt, and basically it does some pretty busted things with fuse cards, um, which we'll get to in a minute. But basically, he took this to like a second place finish in an IQ or something like that. And everybody is like, oh my gosh, these expertises truly are broken. And then it hasn't done really much of anything since then. So while it is in fact quite broken, it's possible that like the perfect shell hasn't been found yet, but still, it's a fun deck if you're into, throwing out big old Emrakul, the Aeon's Torn, the Spaghetti Monster herself, Grizzlebrand, as I like to call Grizzle Daddy, and then maybe some of the other Eldrazi. This is probably the most optimal shell for Reanimator in Modern today. So we'll run through the deck, and let's just start with the 1 mana drops. We have Serum Visions. This is just going to filter your draws. Really, the way this deck works is it's almost like a bunch of 2 to 3 card combos. And so Serum Visions is trying to help you get those cards together. The big combo is Kari Zev's Expertise, which allows you to gain control of target creature or vehicle until end of turn. Untap it, it gains haste. You may cast a card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. So the key here is you're trying to cast Breaking and Entering. Now there's 2 halves of Breaking and Entering. Unfortunately, the image is really small. But Breaking half, target player puts the top 8 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, and the Entering half is put a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It gains haste until end of turn. So this is a 2 CMC spell, but because of a ruling from April 15th, 2013, if you cast a split card with Fuse from your hand without paying its mana cost, you can choose to use its Fuse ability and cast both halves without paying their mana costs. So the thing is with Kari Zev's Expertise, after you gain target control of creature or vehicle, you get to cast a card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. If you cast Breaking, you can choose to Fuse and cast both halves of Breaking and Entering. And the cool thing is this resolves as one spell, meaning that you would put 8 cards into your library, then put a creature card from a graveyard, doesn't have to be your own graveyard, but a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It gains haste until end of turn. So by playing Grizzlebrand, Emrakul, and Ulamog, the hope is that you're going to hit. And we play the Ulamog just to give ourselves a slightly higher chance of hitting on this. To hit one of these creatures, in terms of hit, meaning putting it into your graveyard, and then at that point putting it onto the battlefield with haste. The other awesome thing about this compared to the previous versions that had Goryo's Vengeance through the Breach is that there's no context or rule here that the creature has to be exiled or sacrificed at the end of turn. So historically these decks have been done with Goryo's Vengeance. Return target legendary creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. That creature gains haste, exile it at the beginning of the next end step. Splice onto Arcane. But the key thing here is exile it at the beginning of the next end step, right? So you get 1 turn to do your nasty things. And that's why Goryo's Vengeance is played in Grizzlebrand with Grizzlebrand as kind of like a 1 turn combo kill, because you're trying to typically, not always, but typically, win in that 1 turn. Through the Breach, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. That creature gains haste. Sacrifice that creature at the beginning of the next end step. So again, you're sacrificing, you're exiling these creatures. So you're getting 1 swing, which is partially why you're playing the Spaghetti Monster Grizzlebrand. You're needing the most important creatures, the biggest creatures with the baddest effects. Ulamog we use for it's kind of like the next best version of Emrakul in terms of the Annihilator trigger. So you get Annihilator 4 versus Emrakul's Annihilator 6, but still pretty powerful. So, all this said, this one lets you attack with an Emrakul with haste, and after you've attacked, you still have Emrakul left over to finish your opponent off the next turn. So pretty awesome. So again, that's one of the 2-card combos. The other 2-card combos, Through the Breach and one of your creatures. So you're trying to Through the Breach one of the creatures onto the battlefield from your hand with haste. The other combos are more 3-card combos, which would be like Faithless Looting paired with Goryo's Vengeance and one of the creatures. So you could Faithless Looting an Emrakul or Grizzlebrand into the graveyard that turn, and then Goryo's Vengeance it. Technically, Grizzlebrand can go into the graveyard prior to the turn, but the key thing is with Emrakul and Ulamog is they have a shuffle trigger where when they go into the graveyard, the entire graveyard gets shuffled. So you have to be able to reanimate them with Goryo's Vengeance right then. And so this is kind of why I consider it a 3-card combo when I say Faithless Looting and Goryo's Vengeance and a creature. And same thing with Is It Charm, Goryo's Vengeance and a creature. And then finally, Collective Brutality, because again, you can use Collective Brutality to discard a card as a part of the cost. Paired Collective Brutality with Goryo's Vengeance and a creature. So, several different combos. Multi-card combos. And so what you're running the Serum Visions and Faithless Looting for primarily is to filter through your draws and try and set 1 or 2 of those combos up in your hand so that you can go for that combo at the most opportune time. Faithless Looting does the same thing. The difference here is Serum Visions. It cantrips. Obviously, you're getting the Scry, but you're not losing any cards. Faithless Looting, you actually have the cost of the card as well, so it is card disadvantage for the first time you cast it. When you cast it with Flashback, you don't have card disadvantage, it's just filtering. But it's important to note because the fact that you're drawing 2 and discarding 2 means it starts to become problematic or difficult to use this card when you're low on cards in hand. Is It Charm has the same feature as a modal option, draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards. But we also play this because it has the ability to target non-creature spells unless its controller pays 2. This is typically only really useful early in the game, but that's kind of like our plan is to try and go off early. This technically could go off as early as turn 1, but that's not super likely, not very consistent. The point being is this allows you to counter a key spell like a Liliana of the Veil, a proactive spell your opponent's using, or like a Rest in Peace, something like that out of the sideboard. But it also gives you the ability to protect your combo when you go for it. So maybe you're worried that they're going to try and mana leak it, and so you go for the combo when you have the mana to protect your key combo spell. And then the third modal portion of this spell is that it does 2 damage to target creature, so a little bit of removal to buy you some time as well. So we all already kind of touched on Goryo's Vengeance being a way to reanimate a legendary creature. That's the big reason why we're playing all these creatures. I wouldn't say that there aren't better creatures, but for example, and I'm going to scroll down here and just look at some of the bigger creatures. World Spineworm is actually a great card is played in Grizzlebrand, could be very useful in a deck like this. However, it doesn't play as well with Goryo's Vengeance, so it really is something that you're wanting to play with Through the Breach. It's possible that there is value in playing this card in this sort of shell, especially considering you could get it in with the Breaking and Entering, for example. But because we're focused on just reanimating and we're not using Nourishing Shoal with this card to gain life like Grizz Shoalbrand does, we're really focusing on legends and the most impactful legends. And so there's lots of other great cards, but we're most of the time only getting them for one turn. And so where a spell like Iona's Shield of Emeria can completely shut your opponent down if you name the right color, most of our reanimation or reanimating spells are not going to keep the creature around for more than one turn. And so this is why we're focusing on Grizzlebrand and the Annihilator Eldrazi. So Through the Breach could put any creature on the battlefield, but again, we're trying to make sure that all of our cards are as functional as possible. And so there is the possibility, where World Spineworm could work with Through the Breach. We're still just going to get the most value out of throwing an Emrakul, doing your Annihilator 6 trigger. Simian Spirit Guide is, a lot of people call it the Lotus Petal of Modern, but basically it's just a way to ramp out extra mana. It also can be used to finish your opponent off after an Emrakul. You could play this as a creature just to get those last couple points of damage in if you have to exile Emrakul after the turn's over. But basically, the value here is to try and cast your spells early. So, if you have a Karizev's Expertise and a Breaking Entering in hand, your opponent has a creature turn 1, and you have 2 lands and a Simian Spirit Guide, you can cast Karizev's Expertise turn 2. So that's what Simian Spirit Guide is there primarily for. The other key card that I want to talk about, a little bit of a change from what I guess I've done from the other versions, is Peer Through Depths rather. It's look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal an instant or sorcery card from among them and put them into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. This is, as I talked about, this deck feels like it's almost like 5 or 6 2 to 3 card combos. And so with Faithless Looting and Is It Charm forcing you to remove cards from your hand, putting them into the library, or into the graveyard rather, when you make those choices, you're trying to kind of develop a game plan of which combo you're playing towards. And if your opponent then thought seizes you or counters a key spell, all of a sudden you're left with pieces in your hand that maybe don't coincide with the specific combo plan that you were going towards. And so what I'm doing here is Peer Through the Depths is basically my attempt to give myself as close to a tutor as I can for the card, or a card that I'm missing towards the combo, or towards the combos that I may have in hand. And so Peer Through Depths is what I'm running to kind of help me piece it all together, if you will. The other thing to note here is Peer Through Depths is an arcane spell. You can end step it because it's instant, get the combo piece you need going into your turn. But because it is arcane, it allows you to use the splice function with Goryo's Vengeance and Through the Breach. They're both arcane spells that have splice, and basically the bonus here is that if you play this spell and splice the other card onto it, then at that point you are going to be able to cast your key finisher spells attached to a, for lack of a better term, just a cantrip. Well, this makes the Peer Through the Depths a bit of a threat. Your opponent may have to counter this on their end step, allowing you to then cast your key spell on their turn. So this is the deck. That's the main deck. Forbidden Orchard, we run this. I mean, the mana base is pretty much just fetches to be able to get your black and red sources, primarily black, because if you're playing against Blood Moon, you want to have access to Swamp. You're not worried about mountains, island, as your other secondary red color. The other thing I should know, Breaking itself can be cast. This was another one of the 2-card combos, I apologize. Breaking plus Goryo's Vengeance. So you can actually just mill yourself 8 cards, and then hope to hit a creature and then Goryo's Vengeance. So that's like another mini combo that you have going on. The other cool thing we talked about briefly was how the breaking and entering piece, if you confuse it through Karyzev's expertise, then you are able to cast both of them as one spell. And so what this means is breaking will first resolve, but there will be no priority change. After breaking resolves, entering will resolve as the second half of that spell, meaning you can put the 8 cards in the library, put one of those creatures onto the graveyard with haste. Your opponent has no opportunity to interact with you between breaking and entering if it's fused through Karyzev's expertise. So what that means is your opponent cannot surgically extract your target. They cannot crack their Nihil Spellbomb after breaking. They can crack their Nihil Spellbomb, or their Relic of Progenitus prior to breaking resolving, but you're still going to get 8 cards to look at, and you have roughly a 70 to 78% chance, depending on how many creatures are in your library, to hit. And so this is part of why it's so busted. So the reason we run Forbidden Orchard is because Karyzev's expertise requires you gain control of target creature. And so Forbidden Orchard, against, say, control decks that don't run many creatures, this gives you a way to generate a creature for your opponent to take control of for Karyzev's expertise. So again, that's the main deck. Grafdigger's Cage and Rest in Peace, Leyline of the Void, those cards still all shut you down on breaking and entering. And part of the sideboard plan against that is if you are playing decks that you're worried about those particular cards, you bring in the extra through the breach. You can bring in a Quicksilver Amulet, which is like a slower, more permanent way to get a creature onto the battlefield from your hand. For Relic of Progenitus, not Relic of Progenitus, Grafdigger's Cage, and just artifact decks in general, you have Shattering Spree to try and handle those. Fatal Push, where you just need to slow down creature decks a little bit because they're fast enough and you just need to buy time. Thoughtseize when you're trying to protect your combo, so this could be good against like a control deck, but it's also good against as a proactive way of trying to take away like a Rest in Peace from your opponent, for example. Collective Brutality, for all the reasons Collective Brutality is good. Again, ways to go against or try and strip your control opponent's key counter spell so that you can go for your combo. Also a little bit of creature removal if you need it, against a super aggressive deck where you can both pitch a Grizzlebrand to Collective Brutality while killing their Goblin Guide and gaining 2 life. So Collective Brutality, against those burn type matchups, it's good in control. It's a way to get a creature into your graveyard. Whereas a Faithless Looting could be countered, Collective Brutality, you can escalate it as a part of the cost. So it's a way of basically not allowing your opponent to counter your attempt to get the creature into the graveyard. Painful Truths, this is going to be against the decks that are just trying to shred your hands with hand disruption, like Thoughtseize, Inquisition, and Kozilek. So you can use this to just kind of reload your hand. And then Dispel and Spell Pierce are just different ways to counter spells that your opponent may be casting, or counter your opponent's counter spells rather. So you go for the combo, you wait an extra turn when you have the mana to protect it. Your opponent tries to counter the spell, you Dispel or Spell Pierce it. Spell Pierce we run instead of like all the spells is also because sometimes you want to be able to protect yourself early against a Thoughtseize or maybe counter a Rest in Peace. So this is the deck. When you take the combos out, typically if you're going to be playing a deck where you're expecting a Rest in Peace or a Leyline of the Void, you're probably going to be pulling maybe even Grafdigger's Cage. You may be pulling Goryo's Vengeance, at least one. I usually don't go below 3 Goryo's Vengeance because they still have to hit that card early, which they're only running maybe 2 of in their sideboard. So they have to hit the card early, have it in hand, have the mana to cast it, and you not to have a fast enough draw to just beat them anyway. So I typically don't run or pull more than 1 Goryo's Vengeance. And then I'll bring in a Through the Breach, a Quicksilver Amulet. Depending on the opponent's deck, though, I may pull a Simian Spirit Guide if I think it's going to be a longer match. I don't need all 4 of them, so that might be where I get room for these extra 2 cards. Beyond that, it's just a matter of, replacing some of your cantrips or determining that maybe Karizev Breaking Entering is not a good plan for the matchup, and so you may cut and shave a little bit here or there. You're not usually bringing in more than 2 to 5 cards for any matchup, and 5 maybe on the high end. One other thing I want to touch on, which I think is a fabulous card for this archetype, unfortunately it is broken on MTGO, is Plunge into Darkness. No, that is not the right card. Apologize, give me just a moment here. It is oh, yes it is. Sorry, my filters are messed up. So we're just going to add this to the deck for just a second. Plunge into Darkness. This is another 2 CMC instant, which I would actually run possibly in place of a Peer Through the Depths, but more likely I might cut maybe an Ulamog or possibly like a Karizev's Expertise to get this into the deck. Maybe an Izzet Charm, I haven't fully decided. But Plunge into the Darkness gives you 2 modal options and the ability to entwine it. One is sacrifice any number of creatures and you gain 3 life for each sacrificed creature. This is not something you're typically going to do, but what you could do in a situation where you needed to is when you Karizev your opponent's creature, if you have the mana available, sacrifice their creature after combat to gain life if they have enough permanents that, say, an Emrakul isn't going to wipe the board. The other more important mode is pay X life, then look at the top X cards of your library, put 1 of those cards into your hand, and exile the rest. So I would like to test this more. This is kind of a new thing I looked for. When I was looking for Peer Through Depths and other ways to kind of put these 2 to 3 card combos together. But basically, the thought on this is, in a lot of games, you may have almost the whole combo, or a specific combo, and be clear to go for it on turn 2 or turn 3, or more likely turn 3, maybe turn 4. Still super early. Your opponent's tapped out, and you just need 1 card, and they haven't put any pressure on you. And so Plunge into Darkness, the thought is, maybe you do 10 damage to yourself, look at the top 10 cards, and you have access to picking the best card for your hand to defeat your opponent. So again, I think this card has some legs here. It may not be better. It may not be worth running more than 1 of them, but potentially a pretty good card in the archetype. The other thing I wanted to talk about is it's possible that instead of 2 Spell Pierces, it may be worth running a Boseiju. Which is a legendary land where you can tap it to add colorless to your mana pool. You have to pay 2 life when you do, but if the mana is spent on an instant or sorcery spell, that spell can't be countered by spells or abilities. And so the thought is you could replace one of your counter spells with this, and that way when you cast your Through the Breach or your Goryo's Vengeance, especially against control decks, you have the ability to cast it uncounterable. So it may be worth doing that. So that is the deck tech on this. I'll try and get a league up for you soon, and I hope you enjoyed.